Hello, and welcome to Read the Bull, the only podcast dedicated to finance and investing books. I'm your host, Stefan Prelog, and today we're recording live from Vassar College, and I'm thrilled to welcome my guest, Paulina Bren. Paulina is a writer, historian, and professor. Her most recent book, which we're going to talk about today, is She-Wolves, The Untold History of Women on Wall Street. It was named one of the 10 best nonfiction books of 2024 by Kirkus Review, and tells the story of Wall Street and the women who dared to enter the old boys club from the 1950s through 9/11. Her previous book, the highly acclaimed The Barbizon, The Hotel That Set Women Free, and was a New York Times editor's choice. Professor Bren teaches in international studies, women, feminist, and queer studies and media studies. Welcome, Paulina.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here.
I'm so thrilled to have you, and I'm glad we could do this live here from Vassar College. We're just here before school's starting, and I was just saying I'm getting anxious, like I hope I'm prepared for you, Professor.
Oh, I know. Don't worry. As professors, we also get the butterflies before first day.
Yeah. Well, we have the book here. Congratulations. I know it's been a huge success.
Thank
and
you.
Now I understand the paperback's coming out soon.
Yes, September 23rd, apparently.
Fantastic.
So I don't have a copy of it yet. I only have my bag that I created, or somebody created for me.
I love that. I love that. And I love a little bit of a different color on the paperback.
It's funny. My books, because they're about women, always when the first sort of draft of the cover comes out, it's always pink.
Yeah.
And I have to fight for it not to be pink. But this time for the paperback, I was like, oh, let's just do pink. So
You leaned into it. I love it.
I did, indeed.
Excellent. Well, I saw you when your book first came out at a talk out in Brooklyn.
That's right.
And it was a great talk, and I've read the book, and it is such an amazing book. But I want to start by asking you why you decided to write it, because I know your first book on the Barbizon Hotel was a huge success, but I remember the talk you said you didn't know a lot about Wall Street and finance. So that seems like a big undertaking to dive in and be like, oh, let's write the history of women on Wall Street.
Yeah.
Why did you decide to do it?
And to say I didn't know much about Wall Street is an understatement.
Okay.
Yes, I don't know what I was thinking, but I knew I was intrigued.
Yeah.
So basically, the book, The Barbizon, that came out in 2021 with Simon Schuster. So it's about this women's only hotel in New York, and I trace it from its opening in the late 1920s through to the 2000s, but it really, in many ways, tells the story of the Barbizon gal of the 40s, the 50s, and how she sort of defined a certain type of New York.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see where that story went after that. And I started to find myself thinking about Wall Street, which I'd never thought about before.
Right.
And I was wondering if the Barbizon gal really tells us so much about New York at a particular time. What can this Wall Street she-wolf tell us about the later period of the 60s, the 70s, the 80s? And so I became really interested in pursuing that. And yes, a very steep learning curve. Though I should say, for me, every book is a steep learning curve because I'm not one of these people who writes the same book all the time. Sure. And so I'm writing another book now. I'm just starting out, and it's the same thing. I'm having to learn a tremendous amount that I know nothing about right now. But there was something very particular, obviously, about trying to learn about the world of finance. Yeah. Well, there were two aspects to it. Three, I'd say. One is that the finance world has its own language.
Sure.
Right? And it really is a form of knowledge you have to learn to some extent. I didn't master it, but obviously I needed to be the translator to people like me because this book I saw as a continuation of Barbizon. It's a book for people like me who think they're not interested in Wall Street. Turns out Wall Street is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. It's about a language that you have to translate. It's also a secretive world.
Yes.
So trying to get these women to talk was also a challenge in many cases. So that was sort of a second issue that was involved. Also just sources. Yeah. Sources were so difficult. I was used to the fact that when you're writing about women in America, when you're writing women's history period, sources don't exist much of the time because they were just tossed out. They weren't seen as important. But in this case, it was, to me, even more shocking because since I was writing about, as you said, my book is from the 1950s through 9/11 in 2001. So it's the second half of the 20th century. But a lot of these women who become characters in my book, they're still living. They're contemporary figures.
Yeah.
So, of course, what's the first thing you do? You Google.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find really any of these women.
Really?
Yes. The famous one, Mickie Siebert, who we'll probably get to, you could find her, but otherwise it was a dearth. It was just invisibility. And that was really incredible to me. And the first place I went in terms of research was to the New York Historical Society.
Okay. Because
they have an oral history archive they created about a decade ago called Wall Street 1950 to 1980. And they interview about 55 Wall Street figures. 50 of them are men, 5 are women.
Okay.
That's not so surprising.
No, that's about the percentage.
Exactly. What is surprising is that when the men, because it wasn't always, but when the men were asked about women, they would always say, well, there weren't any qualified women. There weren't any women to hire. None of this is true.
Right.
It's simply not true.
Yeah.
And so it was about really digging out this story that exists, but had been invisible. So those were the 3 challenges, I'd say.
Yeah, no, it's great. And I can tell you, reading it, I obviously heard you talk. Reading it, I wouldn't have known that you didn't know anything about Wall Street.
Oh, bless you.
I mean, you get, later on talking about collateralized mortgage obligations and things like that. And I was like, it all made sense and it followed along. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
But on the research, it's interesting that you say there was this dearth of information. And you do cite some articles, and you can tell how exhaustively researched it is. I mean, you went back, it sounds like, you looked at old newspaper articles and things like that. So were there nuggets out there about some of these women? Because you do, cite articles here and there. So it sounded like a real kind of treasure hunt in a way. And then when you found these women, how receptive were you? Like you said, you had to be kind of sensitive, and a lot of them are still with us, and they're living history. How receptive were you, and what were those conversations like?
I interviewed a lot of women. They don't all show up in the book. And I'd say altogether, they're sort of interlocking stories of about 20 women, but I emphasize about half a dozen.
Right.
And obviously one criteria is that they're willing to talk. Although I have to say, at least a couple of the women, I think because researching a book takes some time, and you're doing it at the same time that you're doing your other research. So when I started the interviews, it was quite early on. And I think a lot of these women had forgotten that they did the interview, or they didn't think anything was going to come of it, because they were used to being interviewed by journalists. And so either an article shows up a month later or it doesn't. Right. But 2 years later, 2.5 years later, there's a book. Yeah. So I think some of those women were actually quite shocked, not so happy, but they got over it. I had one woman in particular who I won't mention, and she was outraged to hear that a book was coming out.
Really?
And then she's a very pivotal character. And then she wrote to me after it came out, and she was delighted. She was buying up copies for her new granddaughter. But often when you're writing contemporary histories, it really is a scary moment when the book comes out. I had the same problem with the Barbizon, where you have to get it right, and you have to, and I totally understand these women's trepidations. Yeah. Because I'm writing about their lives, I'm turning them into characters, but I have to be completely truthful to their story. Yeah. And so it's always something that's quite stressful. But in terms of the women, what was very important for me was to find obviously women with fascinating stories, and my God, are these fascinating stories. Yeah, 100%. But also they had to be really emblematic of the whole history that I'm trying to tell about New York, about Wall Street. So they have to not only interlock with each other eventually at some point in the larger story of She-Wolves, but they do have to tell a narrative which is larger than those individual stories. And just to give an example, Doreen Mogavero, who's in my book, she's headhunted by Ivan Boesky's people at a time on the New York Stock Exchange. She actually starts at the American Stock Exchange, but by then she's at the New York Stock Exchange, or rather, Boesky sort of moves her over there. But anyway, she's headhunted. And because she is an incredible clerk at a time when incredible clerks were like gold.
Right.
Before we sort of had that digitalization that we have now and so forth, and technology could do a lot of what clerks used to do. Anyway, so she was headhunted, and she became a part of Ivan Boesky's firm. She was a very trusted member. She loved him.
Yeah.
And then he was indicted, and suddenly she became an untouchable.
Right.
Because of that, she was forced to just incidentally, almost inadvertently, create the first and only women-run New York Stock Exchange member firm on Wall Street. Yeah, and these women organically came up, because most of these women will tell you they're not feminists, although they are.
Right.
But organically they came up with this sort of job-sharing sort of structure where Doreen rented out an apartment opposite the New York Stock Exchange as the office. One room was kept as a bedroom for sick children.
Right.
And if you wanted to stay overnight, I mean, all of these interesting schemes. So in other words, the fact that she was with Boesky, the fact that she then became an untouchable and what she did with that, it's a fascinating story, but it's also part of what happens in the 1980s and 1990s.
Right. Yeah. The way you described it, I was like, it seemed like a template for like a company today in terms of the child care and the sensitivity to parental leave and things like that. But you touch on an interesting tension that recurs in the book, because the women today that came around, the doors were opened by the women in the 50s and the 60s, and as you noted, some of them didn't think of themselves as feminists, and it seems that some of them kind of modeled the male behavior. Mm-hmm. So talk about the first women that came along, because a lot of them kind of had to really grit it out. The first positions, as you noted, were, they had to come through as either work their way up through secretarial positions. Sometimes they were able to go at a clerk position. As we know, the floor broker was very difficult to break into. The culture there was very masculine. So talk about those women in the early days, how they broke through. And we'll get to Muriel, Mickie, Siebert, because I thought what was very interesting. She obviously, I think, most of my listeners will know, she was the first woman to buy, a seat on the exchange. But she did it because it was easier to buy a seat than to become a partner.
Yeah.
So talk about those women in the early days and kind of their path.
Yep. So
what they had to endure.
What I didn't expect, and I think that's also why this book, the content, the stories the history ended up being so intriguing to me. Mm-hmm. I did not expect, I should say this, growing up at the time I did, when I thought of Wall Street, I thought of the 1980s. Mm-hmm. I thought of the movie Wall Street. Right. I thought of Working Girl, 9 to 5. I thought of women, with the big shoulder pads, right. And the sneakers on. And, and I have all of that in the book too.
Sure.
But there's this 30 years before that, which were fascinating. I was a completely different kind of woman.
Right.
And in fact, the two generations really clashed once these 1980s women came to Wall Street. The previous generation, they were a scrappy bunch of women. They were delightful. They were, for the most part, it's a generalization, but I have to say it's definitely a pattern. They were working class. They had not gone to college, or they dropped out of college.
Right.
They stumbled onto Wall Street because they were looking for clerical work, and it was often a little bit better paid on Wall Street. And they often came from complicated backgrounds, and they were women who already had a thick skin.
Yeah.
And they were able to withstand what they had to withstand. And part of it is not just the sexual harassment. It was being the only woman in the room.
Right.
The only woman. And there was such an incredible loneliness associated with that too, and a tremendous vulnerability. So they went in there, as I say, doing clerical work. Some of them just started to listen, started to learn. And their entryway, as it was with Mickie Siebert, who really set the tone in many ways, it was through the research department.
Right.
And that made sense because it was already seen as a sort of feminized place of nerdy men who weren't, and you weren't turning over the money there, right? You were just, you weren't producing in that sense. And so it was a feminized space, and very importantly, they could submit their reports with initials instead of their full name. So they could remain gender anonymous for ages.
Right.
So that was really one of the pathways. But the kind of woman who was doing this was a very particular woman. And I talk about the book, how to dress.
Yes.
Yes, that comes out, The Dress for Success for Women.
Yes.
That comes out in 1977 by John Malloy, who saw himself as a wardrobe technician. I believe that's what he called himself.
Yeah.
And it was a book that became a massive bestseller.
Yeah.
And there was a reason for it, not because it was wonderfully written or anything like that, but it was literally a guidebook. I mean, Malloy said it. He said, all these working class, sort of low middle class income young women are coming into the professions.
Right.
And he meant mostly finance, but also advertising and so forth.
Sure.
And it was a guide on how to dress,
Right.
like what color clothes you should wear, what should they be made of, how should you hide your bust line,
Right.
how should you pretend to have been born with a silver spoon in your mouth.
Right.
There's a reason this book came out in 1977. There's a reason that even though the critics panned it, it was a bestseller, because these scrappy women who had been coming to Wall Street slowly in the 1950s, but really stepping up in the 1970s.
Yeah.
That was the demographic.
Yeah. I love that part of the book. And fashion is a kind of a recurring theme because he directed women to kind of, dress almost in a masculine
Yes.
way. And on Wall Street, at least in those early days, you weren't allowed to wear pantsuits.
Mm-hmm. Oh, God, no.
What was it? You had to wear like a skirt that was not below the knee or not above the knee, or
Well, it depended on the time, but certainly I have two stories of the women in my book who were promoted and were told by their bosses. It was sort of a pretty woman kind of scenario where they were like, "Okay, here's a credit card. You have to go dress properly.
yeah,
You can't dress like a hippie hooker."
right,
So quotation marks. And the fashion was a huge part of it. And I think it's not just incidental
right.
that women were told to dress like men. It's not incidental that there were big shoulder pads in the 1980s where it wasn't then just about looking like the men. It was about showing power like the men. Because the women who were coming in the 1980s, many of them coming with MBAs, where before that MBA didn't help you very much.
Exactly.
But now they're coming with their MBAs, with their little suitcase bags, and their sneakers and their power shoulders.
Yeah.
Right. So how women dress makes a huge difference, and you see it also in the 1990s where now women start to they can veer a little bit away from the male model, and you see that again
Right.
Demonstrated in what they can wear.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know the clothes, like you said, it conveyed your socioeconomic status, and that was part of it as well. But you mentioned the pathway through the MBA program, and early on in the book you talk about the first women at Harvard and the MBA program there. And like you said, it wasn't exactly a pathway to Wall Street. So talk a little bit about the early days, because the professors at Harvard were also like the men on Wall Street, weren't exactly welcoming to those women.
Not at all. So the Harvard MBA program was a 2-year program. Mm-hmm. They let women in 1963. Mm-hmm. But women had already had a taste of what it meant to be at the Harvard Business School because, in fact, for a couple of decades, there'd been sort of a parallel program across the river at Radcliffe, a 1-year program for women. It wasn't MBA. It was just this, I suppose, a certificate. I'm not entirely sure. But they would share professors. Mm. And the professors would demean them. And sometimes they would come over to Harvard. They would come as guinea pigs. So they'd be invited to a class if they were going to be talking about selling hats in supermarkets to see what the gals thought.
Right.
So there were women who knew what that experience was going to be like. But then there were the newcomers in 1963, the first legit MBA class of 8 women who in fact the admissions department had been told to pick 8 women who simply were so smart they could never fail because they needed 8 women who would stay.
Right.
The fact that they stayed is amazing because the sort of daily abuse was, I don't know if I want to use the word astonishing because I've now written this book and there's not that much that's astonishing, but to me at least. But of course they were asked every day, you know, or told every day that, you know, you're taking the seat of a breadwinner. Why are you here? To find a husband. Why else would you be here?
Sure.
But again, that loneliness that was then going to be repeated on Wall Street or wherever they went, they would come to, unfortunately, they were also, it was unwise. The Harvard Business School split up those 8 women. So they were in these cohorts, these large cohorts, and they were the only women around. And they'd come into a lecture hall and nobody would sit next to them, in front of them, or behind them. I mean, it was quite brutal. And so in 1963, the first designated woman, Elaine Luthi, a very attractive blonde woman. In my book, there are a lot of Harvard Business School sort of photo shoots of her registering. Those first 8, it was a very confusing experience for all of them. Yeah. None of them ended up pursuing the careers, certainly not straight after business school that they had hoped. In fact, it was really deflating as an experience. And then 4 years later, 1967, along comes Lillian Hobson, who's the first Black woman, who doesn't know she's the first Black woman. And if she'd been told, she probably wouldn't have come. So she was ultimately grateful that she didn't know. But it took her a while, and she realized it was one day when all the first years were in this big auditorium. She's looking around, not a single Black woman around her. She finds 4 Black men. 3 of them become sort of her cohorts, and they work on bringing more Black students and creating the African American Student Union. She would describe these experiences of male faculty didn't know what to do with the women, let alone with the Black woman. They would just scuttle past her. And in terms of just women, I mean, honestly, her experience was bad, but the white women's experience was almost as bad as well. There were women, I give so many examples of, as I say, much of this book is kind of funny in a tragic, comedic kind of way. But there was a woman who already had children, and she was sent out of a class to stay outside for a while because they were going to discuss Playboy, as if she didn't know what a naked woman looked like. So
she had children, so I imagine.
Exactly. She had some sense of it, looking in the mirror. So there were just all these crazy circumstances. And Lillian Hobson she was a real pioneer, and she persevered, and she did a lot of good while she was there for 2 years. But she didn't use the network. She never felt like she belonged.
It wasn't exactly the path that it was for the women, like you said, in the 80s. You mentioned Lillian Hobson. We talked a little about Mickie Siebert. Talk about Alice Jarcho.
Yes,
because she's a central woman in the book, and she was a first, and obviously central to a kind of the history here. So let's talk about her.
So Alice Jarcho. When I said these scrappy young women, I mean, she grew up in Queens with 2 rather abusive brothers. Her mother was a very committed, card-carrying communist who would take her on Saturdays to hand out the communist paper in front of Macy's. Daily Worker, I think.
The Daily Worker,
I think Daily Worker. But that's not why she turned to Wall Street. She turned to Wall Street because she dropped out of college. She wanted to get away from the family. She moved to Manhattan. She needed to be able to afford her flat share, her apartment share. And she ended up on Wall Street in a clerical position. And one day she came in, and the guy who was the manager of the office, suddenly there were these glass doors on the offices, sort of glass walls. And everybody watched as he pulled a gun out and started to sort of wave it around. They had to call 911. They came, they strapped him up to a gurney, and he was gone. And the next person who was supposed to be the manager was a money guy. He was not going to stop. And so she ended up being the manager. And it was often these sorts of things. And these were small brokerage firms. Always, I should emphasize, the big ones were not hiring women beyond the typing pool. These women who were getting a foot in is because there was brokerage firms. They could multitask, they could step in, and it was often an accident. Mickie Siebert became an aviator expert in the research department because she was there as a teletype sort of assistant. And when the the senior researchers, when they were doing well, as a reward, they could just unburden some of their work onto trainees. So Mickie ended up getting aviation because the train guy didn't believe aviation was going to be a big thing. So these things, this is the kind of thing that happened, Life's about luck, I suppose.
Yeah, you talk a little bit about how people in research would often get sectors that other people didn't think were going to be big, and lo and behold.
Yeah, that's how women would get them. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, again, it was various circumstances. And Alice Jarcho, she did the thing. She went from one small brokerage to another. This was the go-go years. She moved up. She became the money person for Tisch, for Larry Tisch. She traded his money. And then she was getting bored. A friend of hers at Oppenheimer said, you should be our broker, our trader on the New York Stock Exchange floor. Now, we all know that Mickie Siebert was the first to get a seat on the floor. She paid for it, and she became officially at the beginning of 1968 the first woman to be a member of the New York Stock Exchange. But she said herself, Mickie Siebert, she said, I have enough enemies as it is. I'm not going to go trade on that floor. I bought that so I could open my own firm. I'm going to send somebody else to do it.
Sure.
So no woman had actually traded on the floor. And Alice knew that. So when this guy at Oppenheimer was like, no, you should do it. And she sort of had a crush on him, which was a problem. So she was susceptible. And she finally relented. And everybody at Oppenheimer knew her. They knew she was qualified, but they were really pissed off that she was going down there to represent them. There was always constant male embarrassment about these things. If you suddenly got a woman boss later on down the line, the incredible sort of heckling and embarrassment and shame and so forth, that always played a role. So they weren't very happy about it. And she knew it was going to be bad, but she didn't know how bad it was going to be. Yeah. She had no idea. And by then, she was a veteran of Wall Street. I mean, she spewed out those 4-letter words. Yeah. She was tough as nails to begin with, and even more so now. And yet, even so, it was really bad. I mean, at one point, she had to have a police escort to bring her in the mornings. She had nasty things sent down the pneumatic tubes to her. If she left her booth, she knew something nasty was going to be there. And of course, as all these women always told me, is when these practical jokes were being played on you, everybody was watching for your reaction. Right. So that was the important moment. You couldn't start screaming. Right. You couldn't start crying. Right. You had to react in a particular way. So women often talk about how they developed a sense of humor about these things.
Right. To kind of give it back to them and show that it didn't impact them. So the 70s you characterize, and again, it seems like the opportunities kind of synced with what was happening in the markets. The 70s brought along a little bit of a downturn in the market. So how did that impact as women were becoming more, getting more positions on Wall Street? How did that impact things?
Well, in some ways, I think women had opportunities in the 70s because the market was down.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite logical, right? Yeah. That when the markets were down, Wall Street wasn't such a desirable place anymore.
Yeah.
And so you could bring a woman in.
Okay. Interesting.
So I think that definitely played into it. And I also feel it's necessary to mention that during these 50 years, Wall Street changed so much. Yeah. When I start the story, Wall Street is this quaint place at the sort of the southern tip of Manhattan. Right. Now, when we talk about Wall Street, it's a much broader environment we're talking about, right? Sure. But it really was Wall Street. And so despite the difficulties for women, and some of them were the same, we can talk about how they couldn't enter luncheon clubs. They had ladies' doors near the service entrance where they were forced to go. They had to climb up fire escapes to one woman to come in and give the talk that she was asked to give a talk at a lunch for men. So all these crazy things were happening, but at the same time, there was a sort of bizarre meritocracy happening. And a lot of these women who I talked to really wanted to emphasize that, these early women, if you could withstand all of this, there was a meritocracy. And also everybody knew each other. Everybody was within a few blocks of each other. It was such a different world. And in the 70s, you still have that world happening somewhat. The New York Stock Exchange member firms, they're now starting to go public.
Right.
So that's a new thing. So it's not quite the private membership aspect of Wall Street that you see in the 50s and 60s. It starts to loosen up in the 70s. You start to see competition. 1975, May Day, brokerage fees start to go in flux.
Right.
So things are happening, but there's that way for these scrappy women to find a foothold. And then, of course, the 80s come, right? And everything changes. Like with this little place becomes in the 80s and 90s sort of the epicenter of America in many ways and our sort of cultural values as well, I think, for better or worse. And so, again, as I was saying before, now you have a very different woman. So from the 70s, the scrappy women still, and now the 80s, when now there's money, and now women are being hired for a different reason. I was constantly told they needed so many bodies in the 1980s. They're willing to hire anybody.
Right.
And that means women too.
Yeah.
And people would just walk in and within 3 weeks, they've been trained to be traders. Like it was just it was all happening so quickly because the money was happening so quickly. Yeah,
I love the part when it gets to the 80s and 90s, and you sync this obviously with the Reagan era and deregulation, and you have the scene when Reagan comes down to the NYSE.
Yeah.
And they're cheering him not so much because of who he is, but what he's saying.
Yeah.
He's basically going to loosen up the rules. And wealth was okay. And I love you contrast the 70s, the austerity there with Rosalind Carter and Jimmy Carter into like the boom time of, flaunting wealth was okay.
Exactly. Exactly. And in those days, certainly the New York Stock Exchange, again, remember, scrappy. It's not just scrappy women, it's scrappy men coming in too, who are finding a way to make money when they don't have those college degrees. So politically, the New York Stock Exchange floor was very much a mixed bag. First of all, nobody really talked about it, but it was mixed. It wasn't at all like sort of a Republican stronghold.
Right.
So when they're cheering for Reagan, they're cheering for a particular vision, which they all become very much a part of.
Sure.
But that's exactly what's starting to happen in the 80s.
Yeah.
And everything just goes it's unfettered now.
Yeah. So in the 80s, you also had kind of a sinking of opportunities. And Lou Ranieri at Salomon Brothers started financial innovation where you were able to trade mortgages. And there was a woman who was at the right place at the right time.
Well, she had a sense of it. So Marianne Spraggins, fascinating. So Marianne Spraggins, it's the very early 80s. We're right on that cusp. And she's a black woman from a prominent New York family. She is a lawyer. She's a law professor in New York.
Right.
There is no reason for her to go to Wall Street. And yet, she did a law degree and then she did a master's at Harvard. And she took a course on international business. And she couldn't get out of her head because the whole group from the course had gone to Wall Street. And as she told me, she sensed that here was a different kind of power than the one she knew from sort of a multi-generational Harlem family that was very involved in New York politics. This was a different power, one that she felt was going to explode, was going to be the most meaningful form of power in this country. And she felt there had to be a black woman at the table. So she quit her job and she managed to, again, through, that was difficult too. She managed to get on the trainee program of Salomon Brothers. Yeah. And it was the first time ever they had actually 5 black trainees. All kind of were knocked off. She ended up being the only one. And as happens in these trainee programs, different department heads come and pick them off, who they want, their favorite ones. They come in with these folders and the photos and the bios, and they kind of know who they want. Yeah,
it's like getting picked for your softball team.
Exactly, and she's the one that's left. So we can, I think many of us can relate to that feeling.
Sure.
She decided that she was either going to make it or she was just going to be carried out on a gurney. And she parked herself in the Salomon Brothers cafeteria next to the cash registers.
Yeah, I love this.
Because even though they were the executive suite lunchroom, dining rooms, even the top executives for breakfast, they went to the cafeteria. So she parked herself there and literally created a desk right in the cafeteria, just sort of inviting people to ask what she's doing there and who she is.
Right.
And she just decided she just didn't care.
Right.
And some people took pity and they'd have her do a report and then so forth and so on. And then one day she got an interview with this guy called Lou Ranieri.
Yeah.
And I mean, mortgage-backed securities was so new. She didn't know what it was. Nobody could really explain it to her either. But she was hired in that department. So a year after training, she finally got a spot because it was embarrassing. I mean, she had to go there no matter what, but she had nothing to do.
Yeah.
And so then she was there, and it ended up being the golden, the golden goose, the golden egg, or whatever it is, of Salomon Brothers. And she was there in the middle of it in the 1980s.
Yeah. Well, 20-some-odd years later, something linked to that happened, which was interesting. But so I know...
Yeah, exactly. There's a whole full arc to that story, which, so you'll have to read the book.
There is, but she was the benefit of that. And what's interesting, too, I think along the way, you detail, and again, you talked about the stories of sexism, discrimination, and even assault that women endured.
Yeah.
There were laws that were passed that helped. But a lot of these firms often would hire women just to satisfy some of these requirements. But obviously the money was a factor. And there's a little bit of a thread saying, a lot of people didn't talk, or it's not as vocal as you've seen in other industries where some of this has been aired because the money was so good, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of them would have to go through arbitration. You talk about that process with
that
firms.
That was key.
Yeah, so you don't hear a lot of the stories, and you'd only go through 2001, but obviously we had the Me Too movement. It never really hit Wall Street that hard, and I think because of this, and I forget the eloquent writing the phrase you said that basically the money kind of helped kind of keep things quiet essentially.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's jump ahead, and I'll have to say I know we're a little short on time, but why did you end the book at 9/11 and that period? Why did you end it there?
I ended 9/11 because it was a moment that a lot of these women in the book shared, right? So it was a way of actually like finding this moment to bring them all together. And you have, one is stepping over. I mean, some of it's quite gruesome. Exactly.
I got very choked up.
Yeah.
You did
No, absolutely.
an amazing job. Yeah.
And it's tricky again because some women said to me, well, I feel like I was there, but it's not my story.
Yeah.
So it has to be dealt with sensitively because I think I just left New York 4 days before 9/11 happened. I was in Southern Illinois and quite the difference. And so I remember it all in sharp relief, though I wasn't there. And yet it was hearing these women's stories and really hearing how they're, walking through the rubble and the, I don't want to say these things, and the blood and everything. And they're doing that. And then Louise Jones, who's an incredible character as well, she just, she'd gone from abandoned baby in a phone booth to a foster child to like a mega winner on the New York Stock Exchange. She just left because she wanted to have a baby.
Yeah.
And she's running in flip-flops and a tank top with a newborn in her arms, running up West Side Highway, trying to get away from the falling towers. So there's this moment where all these women, suddenly we see them in just all together, what they're doing that day, what they're experiencing that day. Yeah. But also I feel like 9/11 was a moment.
Sure.
When I say Wall Street is very sort of an amorphous descriptor now for us, right? Oh, on Wall Street. Well, they're probably in Midtown. They're probably, It was a moment where I think that world collapsed as well, along with the towers. Yeah. And indeed, a lot of the firms realized that they were vulnerable. So they moved a lot of equipment, a lot of things, a lot of data banks to New Jersey, right?
Right.
So you start to see just this diffusion of what had once been a very specific place and site that had a feel and a smell, coffee roasters and the Fulton Fish Market. So that to me was important. And then I talk a tiny bit about 2008 because that was another moment where a lot of these women who'd been working at firms that went bankrupt after 2008, like, or disappeared, right? So like Bear Stearns being one of them, one of the characters, Beth Dater, who just passed recently. And she was a big shot on Wall Street. She was quite the character. And, she'd been a flight attendant before on what was called the Vomit Comet.
Right. Puerto Rico. Yes.
Exactly. So, and she and her husband, a second husband, he was also a big shot on Wall Street at Bear Stearns. He was the mentor for another one of the characters in my book. And after Bear Stearns folded, he didn't know what had been happening. He didn't know, and he had a massive stroke.
Yeah.
So 2008 kind of folded a lot of the stories for these women too.
Yeah.
Barbara Burns had been very successful at Lehman Brothers. She moved over to Barclays. But, I suddenly sensed that her story was really at Lehman Brothers, that had been. So a lot of these women's lives sort of, stories, their narratives ended with the folding of these firms as well.
Yeah, interesting. There's so many women we didn't get to talk about, but you'll have to read the book. I mean, there's so many women, and some you get a little bit more detail than others. I interviewed Patricia Chadwick Walsh, who has her own book, but you talk about her, and she has a very interesting background. But some of these women are starting to write their own stories. I kind of noted that a few years ago that you're seeing, like Bully Market was Jamie Fiore-Higgins about it was My Story of Money and Misogyny on Wall Street, her time at Goldman Sachs. You have Patricia Chadwick's book. You mentioned briefly Sin Fabra, Wolf Hustle. Another woman I interviewed, Damsel in Distress by Dominique Millet. So first of all, do you think this is good that these stories are coming out? Have you read some of these books? And let's end by getting your perspective on what Wall Street looks like today.
Yeah, so of course it's great that they're coming out, but what I do is so different from a memoir. So a memoir can only tell a great story. So these are like Patricia Chadwick's stories, incredible. Yeah. In fact, I tried not to use her too much because the story's so damn good, and she'd written it, so I felt I couldn't encroach too much.
Yeah.
They're great stories, but they're only the story of one person, one experience.
Sure.
And the whole point of She-Wolves and why it has been resonating with readers who have never stepped foot on Wall Street is because it tells such a larger story. It tells a story about just women coming into the workforce after World War II to the present.
Right.
I've had young women say that they can relate to so much of this, both in finance and not in finance. It's a story of New York. I mean, how New York changed from that time. Yep. And Wall Street was a huge part of it, of everything, and not just what was happening there, but as I said before, the cultural values it was emanating them that we consumed, that we identified with. Yeah. So She-Wolves is a huge story, and in that sense, I think I just do a very different thing from what a memoir can do.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's really one of my favorite books on Wall Street.
Oh, thank you.
And I recommend it to everybody. So, Paulina Bren, that's your time on Read the Bull. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. This was lovely. Thank you.